my fellow countrymen. It's barely been 2 years since Karl Marx's equalitarian pipe dreams of communism have become a manifestation, when the Russian disciples of his usurped power had proclaimed the USSR back in 22. But with the communist state's new leader, Vladimir Lenin, having kicked the bucket, his heir, Joseph Stalin, will pick up the mantle under what he now calls Marxist-Leninism. And as fate would have it, those Marxist-Leninists would become our allies 2 decades later, when they helped us liberate Europe from Nazi aggression in 45. Albeit in exchange for the East Sovietization. With the formation of a communist and capitalist bloc, the world as we knew it was divided and seemed destined for perpetual hostility forever.
Except for one. Yugoslavia, now governed by Josip Broz Tito, which, unlike its communist neighbors, was able to liberate itself without much Soviet support, meaning that fewer Soviet troops were required to be stationed in the country to prop up the government. Meaning that Yugoslavia had a lot more independence, which it took full advantage of. This newfound independence came at a price, however, that being the country's expulsion from the Eastern Bloc in 1948. But this was secretly a blessing in disguise, as no longer being forced to abide by Soviet policies meant that Yugoslavia could now make decisions on its own accord. For background, Yugoslav firms pre-expulsion mirrored Soviet firms that were socially owned, which meant that all firms were directly controlled by the state through the appointment of government delegates. In theory, the state, through the managers, could steer production towards meeting everyone's long-term needs. In practice, good quality stagnated, as there was no significant competition to spearhead self-improvement. The Soviet car industry is a perfect example of this. State-sponsored anti-competitive laws de-incentivized innovation, leading to an era of stagnation for over 2 decades. By contrast, Western firms typically operate under the tenets of private ownership, where company management consists of private individuals who share power and find ways to generate more personal wealth. While much more pro-consumer than their Eastern counterparts, private ownership can also employ similar anti-competitive practices, which can also lead to worker exploitation, such as frequent antagonistic attitudes towards labor unions, a hallmark of North American companies. Desiring to avoid both these outcomes, Yugoslavia invented a new means of organization, worker self-management, where democratic worker councils would directly manage their respective enterprises. While nowhere near perfect, particularly in continued anti-competitive laws, productivity across the nation increased shortly after implementation, as worker councils routinely listened to their colleagues' ideas, causing an uptake in morale. Supply and demand, for those that don't know, is a market mechanic which bases the production of commodities on consumer interest. Viewed as valuing short-term wants over existential needs, this mechanic was suppressed by Marxist-Leninist authorities, and production instead was determined by the state itself. Ideally, this would guarantee that high-demand goods were cheap and well-stocked. In actuality, however, resource waste became a formality, as consumer input was systematically neglected, which could be prominently seen in the nation's garment market. Logistical overestimation combined with anti-competitive practices resulted in hundreds of low-quality shoes being discarded in favor of high-quality Western imports. Speaking of, unlike the Soviet Union, supply and demand has laid at the heart of Western economics for generations, which is why the Western products are consistently higher in quality, because consumer input was taken into account. This, however, can be weaponized at the expense of others, as corporations in the pursuit of profit will be more willing to cut costs, like decreasing wages or limiting break times, both of which shockingly lower morale and productivity altogether, and no one wants that. This was foreseen by Yugoslavia, who took it into account when implementing their own version of supply and demand. specifically giving companies their production freedom back, while also criminalizing any cutting costs methods, resulting in a decrease in resource waste and an increase in morale, all without the need of worker exploitation. While Yugoslavia would eventually break up, its reforms have continued to be remembered fondly by many in its successor states. All this to say that these reforms were legitimate economic features that could have thrived under a much more democratic environment. So while many Western countries have begun adopting laws only found in communist states, like universal healthcare and pro-union legislation, it may be time to bring back Yugoslav economics as well.